Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 23 of GT Masters, the review series for Gran Turismo's selection of GT class race cars, but also vehicles which aren't necessarily actual GT class race cars, but that fall into very similar parameters. They look like GT cars, they may have the performance to rival them, or the power, or the PP, etc. Vehicles such as the FXX, the Zonda R, and this particular vehicle, which is a very, very popular track car on GT6, for obvious reasons, the Mazda Furai. Now this is kind of a successor to the 787B in terms of popularity and status that it has among Rotary fans, kind of like a 787B descendant for the modern generation. And of course this car technically doesn't exist anymore because it burned to the ground, unfortunately. It runs on ethanol and it's powered by a pretty decent rotary engine. Now most rotary engines are impressive for performance, but this one is one of the higher models out there. There aren't a huge amount of vehicles fitted with rotary engines. This is one of the better ones on Gran Turismo. It's powered by a 2-litre, or equivalent to a 2-litre rotary engine, which can put out 660 horsepower when fully tuned. And incidentally, if I remember correctly, that's actually exactly the same amount of power that the Mazda Furai puts out when fully tuned on Forza. Or it used to be, as I said, if I remember correctly. That's interesting. It also puts out 378 foot-pounds of torque, so not overly high on torque, but again, not surprising for a rotary. They tend to go for extremely high revving power. And this is a seriously lightweight car. It weighs 675 kilos, making it lighter than any of the LMPs and Group C cars, by far. It's around 80 kilos lighter than a Peugeot 905, which is the next nearest in terms of weight. It's lighter than the Chaparral 2J and various other race cars. It's not the lightest racing vehicle in the game, of course, but it is up there with the best of them, or down there with the best of them, whichever way you prefer to look at it. The PP is pretty high, although not necessarily as high as you might expect. 675. That's actually quite moderate, I would say, for its PP. If you compare that to vehicles with a similar power-to-weight ratio, or not necessarily as good power-to-weight ratios, that's actually nowhere near as high as it could be. If you compare that to something like the Toyota 7, or the Delta Wing, or the Red Bull Junior, all of which have similar ultra-low weights and similar layouts and packages as the Furai, they all have far higher PPs. They're all well over 700. This car is comparatively quite modest in terms of PP. In fact, it's actually a lot lower in PP than vehicles which, on most circuits, wouldn't stand a chance against it, such as certain GTR race cars, some of the Beamers, some of the various other race cars that just, on a twisty circuit at least, would not stand a chance against the Furai. That little weight in such a compact and focused rotary-powered racing vehicle, that's a pretty hard mix to beat. It makes the 787B look heavy. I mean, to do that, it's got to be a pretty amazing machine. Is it as good as the 787B though? Because the 787B is a hugely popular Le Mans car, one of the most popular ever, one of the most recognisable, and is, of course, legendary as well for being the only Japanese car to win the Le Mans. So it's a lot to live up to for any Mazda rotary-powered racing vehicle. Well, to compare it to the 787B isn't really accurate. I mentioned earlier that it's kind of like a more modern variant of it, but really the LM55 is more that kind of vehicle than this. This is more like what the 787B would have become had it turned into a supercar, because the Furai is much more of a track-going supercar than it is a Le Mans car. But the parameters that it falls under are very similar to some GT class machines. Now, we've already mentioned the power, the torque, the weight, the PP. What about the power-to-weight ratio? It's bound to be pretty good considering it has similar specs for power and weight. Well, it is. It's really good. 978 horsepower per tonne, that's almost 1 horsepower per kilo, and that is actually one of the highest power to weight ratios of this series so far. That's higher than the long-tail McLaren F1 GTR, which is in itself a very impressive machine in terms of ability and spec. And like the Furai, the finer McLaren GTR Longtail is also a go-to model for racers. Now, the Furai does have some very distinct disadvantages. It's not a perfect car by any means, although it is popular. It's not a premium car, for a start. Now, that's the least consequential of all of its downsides, but it's still an issue. Why is this still not a premium car? I mean, for a start, it's a newer model, but it's also a Japanese car, a very important one at that. So it really shocks me that this car is still not a premium vehicle. That, however, is of less importance than some other things. And the most notable downside in particular, I would say, to this particular car is actually the top-end performance. Now, it's nowhere near as powerful as many of the other cars in this series, about 2, 3, sometimes even 400 horsepower less. But the top speed is so much slower than almost all of the other cars in this series, of that kind of power level at least, that it really does hinder it on some tracks. The top speed on this car struggles to surpass 210, and even that is only on Special Stage Route X, which is pretty much the easiest track to get speed on because the road is so flat and forgiving. You try and get that speed out of it on a bumpy road such as at the Le Mans or the Nürburgring Ring, and it's just not going to happen. So for top speed, it's awful. It just cannot keep up with really any of the other cars of its calibre. But for acceleration, for grip, for handling, for brakes, it's excellent. So as long as you stick to circuits which allow you to exploit those advantages, it is certainly a great model. And for 1.25 million credits, it's also really good value, being a direct rival to pretty much any of the other great GT cars. So I would definitely recommend checking out the Furai. But that's it overall for this particular episode, so I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.